I only needed somewhere to sleep. Then that old forge seemed to know my name.
She was 25 and homeless. No severance, no room, no family key. Just a canvas tool roll and $2 she had saved from a vending machine refund. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten historic thatching needle forge outside Williamsburg in James City County, Virginia, struck from local maps in 1968. Half the roof had folded inward. The chimney leaned 6 inches toward the marsh. Condemned on October 14th, 2021. It was marked for demolition before the next spring thaw. Inside the iron handle of a giant thatching needle, a sealed hollow had waited more than 50 years with money, a Damascus blade, and a message meant for someone broken open by fire. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ines Marlowe had been mending her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Newport News, she repaired what other people stopped seeing. She wired a lamp whose cloth cord had burned brown, stitched her school coat with fishing line, and kept a kitchen drawer of bent screws because metal, unlike people, often explained exactly why it failed. At 13, she could tell by sound whether a washing machine bearing was dry or merely loose. Her father had left before she learned his middle name. Her mother, Celia, worked motel laundry and measured love in rent paid before the red notice appeared. She could be tender in private, but fear made her practical. And practicality sometimes looked like a locked door. The one person who understood Ines's hands was her grandfather, Ines Marlowe, a shipyard machinist who had learned small-tool blacksmithing from an old farrier near Smithfield. Every Saturday he collected her before sunrise in a green Ford with one primer grey fender. They drove to his cinder-block shed, where he brewed coffee in a dented percolator and let her sort files by tooth and taper. He showed her how to read heat without a gauge, dull red for patience, orange for shaping, yellow only when the steel demanded speed. At noon they ate apple slices from wax paper. Then he set a short bar across the anvil and made her strike until the hammer face landed flat enough to leave no crescent scar. "Do not hit harder than you can listen," Elias told her. He meant the steel would announce its limits, but years later she understood he had also been speaking about people. He died in 2015 after a stroke that took his speech before it took his breath. By the time Ines reached the shed, her mother had sold the anvil, the post vise, the leather apron, and 3 wooden chests to cover hospital bills. Only the smell of coal remained in the block walls. Elias's notebooks disappeared with the tools. 10 years later, Ines worked second shift at Tidewater Precision Components, feeding steel blanks into a hydraulic press that stamped marine brackets. The floor manager, Grant Voss, wore polished boots that never carried metal dust. He controlled the shop through silence, standing behind workers until they increased pace, then recording the faster rate as the new minimum. He spoke softly during safety meetings and cut gloves, ear protection, and overtime from the same ledger. On November 3, 2025, he stopped the line at 9:17 p.m. and read 12 names without looking up. Ines's came 7th. Their insurance ended at midnight. She returned to her rented room carrying one object from the plant, a brass micrometer Elias had given her. Her suitcase sat beneath the porch light, its zipper split and one sleeve trailing onto the wet boards. The landlord stood behind the screen door. Celia was inside, visible at the end of the hallway, holding a folded dish towel against her waist. "You cannot stay here another night. Ines Marlowe." 8 words. The deadbolt turned before Ines could ask whether her mother had agreed. Celia did not speak. She lowered her eyes to the towel and pressed one thumb along its crease. Ines picked up the suitcase, tucked the loose sleeve inside, and carried the micrometer in her coat pocket, because it was the only thing the rain could not soften. For 6 weeks she moved west and north by the price of shelter. In Hampton, she slept 2 nights beneath the concrete stairs of a parking garage and spent 40 cents on tea. In Richmond, she used a church cot until the women's room filled, then slept behind the main library loading dock with her tool roll under her neck. 3 afternoons sorting donated cans earned her $1.08, but bus fare and bread reduced everything to $2.68. She washed in gas station sinks before dawn, dried her socks over restroom hand blowers, and learned which grocery vestibules stayed unlocked after midnight. Near Toano, a deputy told her to move from an abandoned feed shed, though sleet had begun tapping the tin roof. She walked until the sky paled. On the 43rd day, she entered the Williamsburg Regional Library to warm her hands around a radiator. A corkboard beside the genealogy room held tax notices, piano lessons, and one county disposal sheet printed crookedly on pale blue paper. At the bottom was a parcel listed as former Thatching needle forge, structure unsafe, contents included. Minimum bid, $2. Bids closed at 4 that afternoon. Ines read the notice 3 times. Then she opened her palm and counted 2 worn bills, leaving 68 cents in coins for food she had not yet found. At 3:26 she copied the parcel number onto the back of an expired bus transfer and asked the librarian which road led to the county clerk. By sunset, she was walking toward a deed she did not yet understand, with rain beginning over the pines and Elias's micrometer striking softly against the coins in her pocket. The clerk's office closed before Ines reached the courthouse, so she spent one of her remaining coins calling the number printed on the disposal notice from a payphone beneath an awning. A recorded voice told her bids could be submitted at 9 the next morning. She slept behind the library's brick service wall, woke with rain in her hair, and placed both dollar bills on the counter when the doors opened. By noon, the county had accepted the only bid. The bus west carried her 12 miles along wet fields before the driver stopped at an unmarked pullout and told her the remaining distance could not be reached by transit. Ines walked 9 more miles with the suitcase handle wrapped in a strip torn from its lining. The temperature fell to 31 degrees before dark. She crossed a ditch and slept in a hay barn whose owner had left one side unlatched, burrowing beneath loose timothy while mice moved inside the walls. Frost whitened the doorway by morning. The nearest settlement amounted to a narrow bend in the road. She passed Mercer's Feed and Seed, Bellamy Farm Supply, the Rosa Rye Cafe, Carter's Hardware, and a repair garage called Whitlow Motors, where an old Chevrolet waited on blocks beneath a pecan tree. Each sign had been repainted so many times the boards had become thicker than the words. The James City County Clerk's satellite office occupied the front room of a former post office, with tall windows and radiators that clicked without warming the corners. Ines stepped inside carrying damp straw on her coat. A woman behind the counter looked first at the suitcase, then at the $2 receipt in Ines's hand. The clerk wore a silver braid coiled tightly at the back of her head. Her nameplate read MRS, Evelyn Pritchard. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Pritchard opened a brown folder and aligned its pages against the counter with 2 measured taps. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. The clerk studied her for several seconds. You have somewhere else to go? Ines kept both hands around the suitcase handle. No, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard did not soften, but her fingers stopped tapping the folder. She turned the deed toward Ines and marked 3 places with a fountain pen. The ink feathered slightly on the county paper. Ines signed each line, writing her full name carefully enough that the letters did not tremble. The clerk carried the deed to a brass recording press mounted beside a cabinet. She slid the page beneath its circular plate and lowered the handle. The stamp struck with a deep, final sound, like a hammer falling squarely on an anvil. John Tyler Highway East, Mrs. Pritchard said. Turn south at Forge Mill Road, after the second cattle gate. Take the gravel lane beside the split walnut. The lane ends at the property. She lifted the deed, then paused over the signature. Ines nodded. The room seemed to narrow around the radiator's ticking. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Pritchard opened the folder again, this time from the back. A yellowed transfer sheet had been clipped beneath the condemnation report. He came here in 1994 asking about this place. Said he was tracing a toolmaker named Samuel Marlowe. The county would not let him inside because the roof had already failed. Ines moved closer to the counter. He returned twice, Mrs. Pritchard's thumb rested beside Elias's name in the visitor log. The last time, he brought drawings. Wanted to compare the forge hearth with something his grandfather had described. Records were missing, and the owner would not answer letters. County policy was to return them. The clerk closed the folder. Whether they reached him, I cannot say. She placed the deed inside a used manila envelope and wrote the parcel number across the flap. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out one of the $2 bid, and smoothed it beneath a glass paperweight. The county only requires $1 to establish consideration, she said. The second will remain with the file until someone decides what history is worth. Ines left with the envelope tucked under her coat. Forge Mill Road narrowed past pasture fences silvered by weather. A man repairing wire near the first gate raised 2 fingers without speaking. His red hound came to the ditch, barked once, then followed Ines at a distance until the man called, "Moses, leave her be." Beyond the second gate, black walnut trees leaned over the lane, their branches bare and jointed against the afternoon sky. The forge appeared slowly through them. It was smaller than Ines had imagined, perhaps 28 feet long and 18 wide, built from hand-hewn oak framing filled with dark brick nogging. The north wall bowed outward beneath a roof patched in cedar shakes, sheet tin, and 1 square of tarred canvas. A stone chimney rose from the west end with a crack running through 6 courses. Above the door hung a faded plank sign. Only 3 words remained visible beneath lichen: Marlowe Thatching Tools. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. The surname did not feel like ownership. It felt like being recognized by something that had no eyes. The front door had swollen inside its frame. Ines set down the suitcase, inserted the blade of her pocket screwdriver near the latch, and worked it gently until the wood released with a groan. Cold air came out carrying soot, wet timber, mouse nesting, and the mineral smell of old iron. Her boots crossed a floor gritty with fallen mortar. The front room held a workbench beneath 2 broken windows, a brick forge dark with rainwater, and an anvil whose horn had been chipped blunt. When she brushed the bench, fine black dust coated her fingertips and tasted bitter when she touched her lip without thinking. Somewhere in the rafters, a drop struck metal at steady intervals. The back room had once been used for storage and sleep. A narrow iron bed frame stood against the wall without springs. Bundles of ruined reed lay beneath a shelf, and a leather bellows had collapsed inward like an empty lung. Through a hole in the roof, Ines could hear crows moving from tree to tree. The place gave back every sound: her breathing, the scrape of the suitcase, the small click of Elias's micrometer when she set it on the sill. She found no electricity, no pump handle at the sink, and no door on the stove. But the floor near the back wall was dry. She swept it with a bundle of stiff reeds tied by wire, laid her coat beneath her shoulders, and used the suitcase as a barrier against the draught. Night came early through the missing panes. The temperature inside settled only a few degrees above the field. Ines ate half a heel of bread saved from Richmond and listened to wind pressing through the roof seams. Once, something moved behind the plaster. Once, the chimney released a small fall of soot. She placed the deed under her shirt, the micrometer beside her hand, and looked toward the workroom doorway, where the outline of the anvil remained darker than the surrounding dark. The house had been waiting for her. On the first morning, Ines found the well 30 yards behind the forge beneath a lid of warped oak. The rope had rotted through, but the stone lining remained sound, and the water stood 8 feet below the rim. She lowered a tin cup on electrical wire, waited for the sediment to settle, then boiled what she drew in a blackened kettle found beneath the workbench. The outhouse leaned toward the creek and had no door, only 2 leather hinges hanging from square nails. She tied a feed sack across the opening and weighted its lower edge with a brick. By the 3rd night she knew which floorboards complained under her left heel, which one near the forge gave a hollow knock, and which plank beside the back wall could be crossed silently if she stepped close to the joist. She walked into the settlement that afternoon with the micrometer in her pocket and the county deed folded inside her coat. Carter's Hardware smelled of pine shelving, kerosene, and the dry iron scent of loose nails stored in wooden bins. Behind the counter stood a broad man with 1 white eyebrow and 1 brown, as though winter had reached only half his face. "Name's Silas Carter," he said. "You bought the old Marlowe place." Ines laid a short list on the counter. "I need enough to make the chimney safe." Silas read it without comment, then looked at her boots, still dark with creek mud. He turned the paper over and wrote a count across the back in block letters. "Then you're paying later." From beneath the register he took a stained booklet titled Repairs for Farm Buildings and placed it on the counter. Its spine had been reinforced with cloth tape. "My father used this until the pages learned his hands," he said. "Bring it back when yours do." She bought only what the chimney required: a wire flue brush for $7.25, 20 feet of rope for $2.40, a half-pound box of masonry nails for $1.10, 2 pounds of furnace cement for $3.85, and a canvas drop cloth marked down to $2. Silas entered each figure in a ruled ledger and drew no line beneath the total. The chimney took 6 hours to clean. Ines tied the rope through the eye of the flue brush, climbed onto the lowest roof section by bracing a ladder against the oak sill, and straddled the ridge where the shake still held. She lowered the brush through the chimney crown until it caught at the first bend, then worked it with short turns rather than force. Creosote came loose in hard black flakes, some glossy as broken glass. Twice the brush jammed. Each time she climbed down, reached through the missing stove opening, and pulled from below until the rope moved again. By mid-afternoon the front room was covered in soot despite the drop cloth. She filled 3 buckets with debris, including a bird's nest bound with horsehair and 1 corroded spoon. The final sweep released a dense fall that struck the hearth like gravel. Afterward she held a mirror beneath the flue and saw a clean grey circle of sky. She packed the largest cracks with furnace cement, drove masonry nails across 1 fractured joint to give the patch a key, and waited until evening before testing it. The first fire was no larger than both her hands. She fed it cedar splinters, then dry walnut twigs gathered from beneath the lane trees. Smoke hesitated at the throat, curled once into the room, and then rose cleanly. Ines sat on the floor and watched the draft strengthen. Heat reached her face before it reached her feet. She boiled water and stirred in the last handful of oats Silas had added to her sack without recording them. The meal tasted faintly of soot and iron, but it was hot. She ate it from the kettle with the corroded spoon after scrubbing the spoon with sand. The workroom waited behind a warped plank door at the far end of the forge. In daylight, its surviving contents became clear, one object at a time: a legate head of ashwood, faced with rusted iron, a swage block whose grooves matched 3 needle diameters, 2 long tongs with reins polished smooth by old palms, a hand-cranked drill press frozen at the spindle, a bundle of hemp twine hardened by damp, a broken Fuller-stamped Ines Marlowe, and 6 thatching needles, each nearly a metre long, bent or scaled with rust. The largest needle lay beneath the bench. Its steel shaft was thicker than the others and tapered gradually from a flattened eye to a dark iron handle wrapped in cracked deerskin. Ines lifted it by the shaft and felt the balance pull toward the grip. That was wrong. A tool made for passing cord beneath reed should carry weight along its length, not hide it at the hand. She set it on the bench beside a sound needle and tapped both handles with the wooden end of a file. The ordinary grip answered with a dense, short note. The larger one rang lower and held the sound for nearly a second. Ines weighed them by suspension. She tied twine at each midpoint, hung them from a roof hook, and added square nuts to the lighter needle until both balanced at the same angle. The difference was almost 4 pounds. She removed the deerskin wrapping slowly. Beneath it, the cast iron handle showed no screw line, only a narrow seam darkened with old grease. At the butt was a circle of cedar no wider than a quarter, driven flush into the metal and stained to resemble rust. She did not pry it. First she warmed the handle near the fire, never close enough to make the iron uncomfortable to touch. When the grease softened, she cleaned the seam with a needlepoint. Then she placed the handle upright in the vise, padded the jaws with folded leather, and pressed the cedar disc with a blunt punch. Nothing moved. She turned the punch and pressed again, this time feeling for rotation rather than depth. The disc shifted less than 1/8 of an inch. A hidden thread released with a dry click. Ines stopped breathing. She unscrewed the cedar plug with her fingertips. Behind it lay darkness and the smell of camphor. She tilted the handle downward over the drop cloth. The first package emerged wrapped in oilskin and tied with waxed linen. Inside was a small crosspeen hammer, its face bright beneath a film of grease, and 3 narrow chisels ground for punching cord eyes. A second roll held strips of high-carbon steel marked in chalk with heat numbers and taper ratios. The third contained folded technical drawings on onion skin paper, each showing a needle under twist, load and bend, with calculations written in Elias's hand beside older ink. Last came a tin box that barely cleared the hollow. Its lid had been sealed with beeswax. Ines warmed the edge between her palms and lifted it with the point of the smallest chisel. Inside lay paper currency folded into packets, coins wrapped in muslin, Vone steel needle no longer than her forearm, and a letter tied with blue thread. The short needle was Damascus steel. Its surface carried pale waves from point to eye, and the spine had been engraved in careful letters. The point is not made to pierce and ruin, but to pass through and bind what has come apart. Ines placed it beside Elias's micrometer. She counted the money only after the fire had burned low and the door was barred with the workbench stool. The bills came to $25,900. The coins added 900 more, Morgan silver dollars, worn Mercury dimes, Barber quarters, and 3 gold half-eagles wrapped separately in wool. Beneath them lay a purple heart dated 1944, its ribbon faded almost grey. The total was $26,800. She counted it again, making stacks by denomination and recording each amount on the blank back page of Silas's manual. No stack was touched twice without a mark beside it. When she finished, she returned every bill and coin to the tin box and set the medal on top. The letter remained unopened. Its paper had yellowed around the blue thread, and one corner bore a small brown stain shaped like a thumbprint. Across the front, in handwriting Ines knew from labels on old tool drawers, was a single word, "For you." She carried the box outside and sat beneath the split walnut tree. Beyond the field, water moved through the marsh in narrow silver channels. A heron stood near the reeds without lifting its head. The cold entered her sleeves, but she did not return inside. For the first time since the factory doors had closed behind her, Ines had more than she needed for the next morning. She watched the dark water until the last line of light disappeared. Leaving the letter unread beside her knee, the house had been waiting for her. Morning came with a thin glaze of ice over the water bucket. Ines carried the tin box to the bench, set the Damascus needle beside the micrometer, and untied the blue thread. The handwriting on the envelope leaned forward with the same narrow capital M. Elias had used on tool labels. She touched the first line once before opening it. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the forge has outlasted my courage and perhaps my name. Dr. Walter Haynes at St. Mary's Hospital in Richmond told me in March of 1968 that the growth in my lung would not wait through another winter. He said 6 months. I have used 4 of them deciding what should be hidden and what should be left plain. The Marlowes came to this work through 4 generations. Samuel Marlowe began forging roof needles here in 1788 after leaving Yorktown. His daughter Eliza kept the accounts and tempered the smaller tools from 1816 until 1859. Her son Thomas carried the trade through the hard years after Appomattox and taught my father Gideon, who reopened the hearth in 1897. I, Ruth Eliza Marlowe, became the last keeper when Gideon's hands failed in 1926. The trade closed on September 17th, 1936. Since then, this building has known more than 30 years of silence. I swept it, oiled the vise, and kept the chimney covered, but no orders came. Reed roofs disappeared. Builders chose tin, asphalt, and speed. My husband Daniel was lost in the Meuse-Argonne fighting in October of 1918. Our son Samuel died at Anzio in February of 1944. The medal in the box was his. I could not bear to place it in a drawer where no working hand would ever find it. If you intend to use the forge, begin with restraint. High-carbon steel for the long needles should reach a bright cherry heat, near 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, before drawing. Do not strike below dull red, or the grain will open. For the eye, punch from both faces and leave 1/3 of the web before drifting through. Quench in 3 parts water to 1 part brine, then temper at approximately 575 degrees until the surface shows a blue-grey skin. A needle should flex under twist and return true. If it remains bent, the fault began before the quench. The drawings include my father's proportions and my corrections. The short Damascus needle was made from alternating shear steel and wrought iron, folded 7 times. It is not meant for sale. It is proof that strength can hold a seam without becoming rigid. The money came from work, not luck. Some was earned from tool orders, some came from Daniel's insurance, some from the sale of land after Samuel's death. I kept it because I could not decide which living person could be trusted with it. Use only what keeps the roof, hearth, tools, and your own body from failing. Do not let the money make decisions the work has not earned. Inheritance is not what remains after a death. It is the unfinished task placed into another pair of hands. A tool is inherited when someone learns why its weight sits where it does, why the edge is ground at that angle, why the handle is shaped for a tired palm. Everything else is storage. There is a marker behind the forge, near the walnut roots. Beneath it you will find the lantern Gideon carried when he checked the cooling steel after midnight. Light it once. Even if you never light it again, the house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. August 21, 1968. Ines read the letter twice. The second time, she paused at the temperatures and ratios, hearing Elias's voice inside Ruth's measurements. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, retied the blue thread, and returned the letter to the tin box without smoothing away a single wrinkle. Behind the forge, the walnut roots broke the ground into dark ridges. She searched near the southern trunk until her boot struck a flat stone hidden beneath leaves. Its surface bore a shallow mark shaped like a long needle passing through bundled reed. Ines knelt, cleared the edges with her hands, and lifted it enough to expose a narrow cavity lined with brick. Inside lay a brass lantern no taller than her forearm. Its mica windows were clouded, but the tank still held a faint odour of kerosene. She carried it to the bench, cleaned the burner with a strand of copper wire, trimmed the hardened wick, and filled the reservoir from a half-bottle Silas had placed on her account. The flame rose small and blue before settling into gold. Its light reached the anvil, the damaged legat, and the long needles hanging against the wall. It did not restore anything. It only made the room visible. That afternoon, Ines wrote 4 names on the manual's back page. Silas Carter, who had opened a ledger without asking for proof. Evelyn Pritchard, who had left $1 beneath glass instead of letting the county swallow both. The hay farmer whose unlatched barn had kept frost from her hair. Doris at the Rose Rye Cafe, who had slipped 2 biscuits into a paper bag after seeing Ines count coins through the window. None of them had solved her life. Each had moved one obstacle far enough for her to take the next step herself. Perhaps someone once did that for you. A meal left without explanation, a ride offered in bad weather, a door held open when every other door had closed. Tell us in the comments about one small kindness you still remember, and, if you can, pass its weight forward without asking whether it will be noticed. That night, Ines placed Ruth's letter, Samuel's medal, Elias's micrometer, and the Damascus needle beside her bedding. The brass lantern burned on the floor until its flame shortened, then went out without smoke. The first snow arrived on December 2nd, 2025, laying 4 inches across the broken roof and filling the forge room with a cold reflected light. Ines read the roofing chapter in Silas's manual 3 times, once beside the lantern, once aloud while measuring, and once with a pencil marking every instruction she did not fully trust. The roof planes measured 29 by 11 feet each, allowing for overlap, waste, and the missing north section. She calculated 700 cedar shingles, 4 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 18 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Silas checked her figures, changed only the nail total, and placed a roofing hatchet on the counter. It had belonged to his older brother. He would object to it rusting, Silas said. A retired roofer named Amos Bell came after hearing about the job at the cafe. He was 72, narrow as a fence rail, and missing the tip of his left little finger. When Ines asked his rate, he climbed the ladder without answering. They worked 11 days. Amos showed her how to sister a cracked rafter by fastening a sound oak board alongside it, transferring the load beyond the split. They snapped a chalk line for every 3rd course and kept 5 inches of shingle exposed beneath the weather edge. Amos drove nails with 3 strokes, set, carry, finish. On the 4th morning he pointed with his hatchet. Ines raised her hammer. She did. By December 15th, the last ridge shingle lay beneath a cap of folded copper salvaged from the shed. Amos refused money, accepted coffee, and left without waiting for thanks. That night snow slid from the new roof in one clean sheet. Nothing fell through. January exposed the chimney's true damage. Several bricks had spalled until their faces could be rubbed away with a thumb, and the mortar between them had turned to pale powder. Ines removed each failed joint with a narrow plugging chisel, never cutting deeper than the brick edge, then brushed the cavities clean with a stiff sash tool. Silas helped her mix the repair mortar, 3 parts washed sand to 1 part hydraulic lime. Around the firebox throat, they added fire clay at a ratio of 1 part fire clay to 2 parts lime mortar. The mixture held when pressed into a ball but broke cleanly under a finger. For 3 weeks the temperature stayed in the 20s. Ines worked without gloves because she needed to feel whether the joints were full. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb, and she warmed them around a jar of hot water wrapped in cloth. She replaced 6 bricks, repointed the lower courses, and rebuilt the chimney crown with enough slope to carry rain away from the flue. On January 28th, she lit a test fire with newspaper, cedar, and 3 pieces of seasoned walnut. Smoke climbed at once. She added 1 larger split and watched the flame pull hard toward the throat. Outside, the chimney released a thin grey column that rose straight above the walnut trees. No smoke entered the room. The floorboards were white pine, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails whose square shanks had held for nearly 2 centuries. Ines lifted only the boards that had rotted through at the ends. She numbered each one in chalk, repaired the joists beneath them, and returned the salvageable planks to their original places. Silas rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She made 3 passes, first with 80 grit to remove grime and broken finish, then 120 grit to close the roughest scratches, and finally 220 grit by hand near the walls where the machine could not reach. The work filled the room with pine dust that smelled clean beneath the older soot. She drove the rosehead nails back with a small set so their faces remained visible but would not catch a bare foot. Then she warmed linseed oil near the hearth and brushed on 3 thin coats, wiping away what the wood refused to take. Each coat cured for 48 hours. The boards changed slowly from dull brown to dark honey, then toward mahogany, where centuries of iron dust had entered the grain. One morning she woke before daylight and could not lift the sander. She carried the kettle outside instead. A great blue heron stood in the marsh, its long neck folded against the wind. Ines sat on the well lid and watched it remain perfectly still for almost an hour. She did no work that day. The following morning, she finished the back room without hurrying. There were 8 windows in the forge. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes secured by bent nails and strips of cloth. The 8th contained one original pane dated to 1788, thin and uneven, with small wavering bubbles trapped inside it. Ines removed that pane first. She labelled it, wrapped it in a wool blanket, and stored it beneath the bed frame until the sash had been repaired. For the others, she scraped each glazing rabbet clean, brushed the bare wood with linseed oil, and rolled DAP 33 putty between her palms until it softened. She pressed a narrow bed into the sash, seated the glass without forcing the corners, then drove glazing points every 8 inches. The outer putty bevel met the sight line on the inside edge, shedding water without covering more glass than necessary. 4 sash cords had broken. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, threaded each line over its pulley, and tied a figure-8 knot at the cast-iron counterweight. The repaired sashes rose without twisting and stayed where she left them. The original pane returned to the east window. In afternoon light it bent the walnut branches into soft waves, preserving every flaw that modern glass would have erased. On the last window, Ines drew the putty knife in one uninterrupted pass from corner to corner. A chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch outside, close enough that she saw its claws tighten around the bark. She held the blade still until the bird flew away. The walls had been plastered over hand-split oak lath, each strip narrow enough to bend under pressure and rough enough to hold the old keys. Near the chimney, heat and water had broken 3 wide patches loose. Ines's first repair sagged before noon. The second cracked around its edges. The third slid from the wall in one heavy sheet and struck the floor without breaking. Silas brought her a burlap bag of horsehair left from his father's shop. She washed it, separated the strands, and mixed them into fresh lime plaster until every handful pulled apart without clumping. The scratch coat went on first, pressed between the lath and scored diagonally while damp. She followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it untouched for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finish coat was 1/8 inch, drawn flat with a steel trowel and softened at the edges with a wet brush. When the final surface began to pale, she rested her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris from the Rose Rye Cafe had red spectacles that slipped down whenever she looked into a paper bag. Twice a week she left one on the forge doorstep before sunrise, folded shut with a wooden clothespin. Inside might be bean soup, cornbread, or 2 boiled eggs wrapped in newspaper. When Ines carried the empty bags back and offered payment, Doris pushed the coins across the counter with one finger. A teenage boy named Caleb arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. His coat sleeves ended above his wrists, and he had a pale scar beneath one eye. Without asking permission, He began reducing storm-fallen walnut into stove lengths. Ines offered him $2 from the tin box. He stepped back as if she had raised the maul toward him. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all he explained. He stacked the wood beneath the eaves, swept the chips into a basket, and returned the following Saturday. Reverend Boyd walked past each morning on his way to the small Methodist church beyond the creek. He wore a brown felt hat with rain darkening its brim. At first he only tipped it. In February, he stopped near the gate while Ines stood on the ladder fitting a repaired shutter. He raised 2 fingers toward the roof. Then he continued down the road, leaving the prayer between the walnut trees. Ines postponed the cellar until February 11th because the steps remained slick with seepage. When 3 dry days finally came, she lifted the trapdoor behind the forge hearth and lowered Gideon's lantern into the opening. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room floored with fitted fieldstone. The walls sweated where earth pressed against them, but the joists above were sound. At the center lay one dressed granite slab, smoother than the surrounding stones and carved with the same mark found behind the forge, a long needle passing through bundled reed. Ines swept around it and tested the edges with her fingertips. She did not lift it. Beneath the 3rd step, something wooden showed through a gap in the mortar. She loosened it with a narrow pry bar and drew out a small oak box darkened by damp. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped into the looped eye of a thatching needle. Beneath the key was a tin type wrapped in wool. It showed a young woman standing outside the forge in the summer of 1903. She wore a long work apron, Vaughan sleeve rolled above the elbow, and held a finished legget against her hip. Her face was narrow, her hair parted severely, and her left eyebrow rose slightly higher than the right. It was Ines's face before Ines had been born. On the back, scratched into the metal beneath a line of faded ink, were the words, "Ruth Marlowe, daughter of Gideon, age 25, summer of 1903. Ines carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel beside Samuel's medal. She tried it in the desk, the tool chests, the old padlock, and the iron cabinet beside the forge. It opened none of them. There it remained. By March, snow withdrew into the ditches, and the creak grew loud enough to be heard from the workbench. Walnut catkins lengthened above the lane. Green points appeared along the marsh where the reed beds had seemed dead. Ines did not begin forging full-length thatching needles that spring. The drawings required judgment her hands had not yet earned. She chose 1 mercury dime from the cache and exchanged it for mild steel practice stock, coke, and a new pair of safety glasses. On short samples, she learned to draw a taper without thinning one face, punch an eye from both sides, and recognize the instant steel moved from willing to tired. The failed pieces went into a wooden box marked Lessons. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ines completed her first full thatching needle. She began before daylight with a length of high-carbon steel measured against Ruth's drawing. At bright cherry heat, she drew the shaft beneath alternating hammer blows, rotating it exactly 1/4 turn between courses. She punched the eye from both faces, drifted it clean, and quenched the needle in 3 parts water to 1 part brine. After tempering, she clamped the handle and twisted the shaft through the angle Ruth had marked. The steel returned straight. Ines laid it across the anvil and listened until its quiet ring disappeared. The forge no longer resembled a ruin, though nothing inside had been polished past its working life. White pine floors held their dark sheen. The repaired plaster showed faint changes in tone where old met new. 8 windows admitted winter light, including the wavering pane from 1788. Gideon's lantern hung above the bench, and Ruth's Damascus needle rested in a shallow walnut case, where hands could see it without touching. The brass key remained on the mantel until Caleb noticed a narrow iron plate fixed to the oldest walnut tree. He had returned taller. His voice settled lower to help remove a dead limb above the roof. While clearing ivy from the trunk, he found the plate beneath a fold of bark. At its centre was a keyhole blackened with age. Ines brought the brass key outside. It turned once. A section of the plate released, revealing a dry cavity lined with cedar. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note protected by waxed cloth. The fabric carried no mildew. Its blue field had faded around the edges where it had been held many times. The note was dated November 12, 1918. Vone Day, after the armistice ended the fighting of the First World War. Ruth had written that she placed the flag there after learning Daniel would not return from France. She had received no body, only a telegram, and the name of a forest he had crossed before dying. She could not bury him beneath the walnut tree, so she buried the flag's silence instead. She asked that whoever found it carry Samuel's medal to a place where military dead were named aloud and leave the flag folded, not displayed. Ines read the note beneath the bare branches. Caleb removed his cap and held it against his coat. On May 27, 2024, Memorial Day, Ines carried Samuel's Purple Heart to Yorktown National Cemetery. She placed it beneath a small arrangement of laurel beside the stone marking soldiers lost overseas. No speech was given. Reverend Boyd stood with her for 11 minutes, then said Samuel Marlowe's full name before they walked back to the road. The money in the iron handle remained mostly untouched. Ines used $1 Morgan to pay for hydraulic lime when the chimney failed, 1 mercury dime for practice steel, 1 barber quarter toward replacement glass, and 1 gold half eagle when the well pump finally required a new cylinder. Every exchange was entered in Ruth's ledger with the date, purpose, and amount. The remaining bills and coins went back into the tin box. Ines wrapped it in fresh oilskin, added silica packets Silas ordered for her, and returned it to the hollow handle with Ruth's letter, her own repair accounts, and the drawings protected between sheets of linen paper. She sealed the cedar plug with beeswax, but did not hide the seam beneath deerskin. On the outside of the handle, she stamped 2 words, "The next one." The shop reopened without announcement. Doris pinned a white index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for piano tuning and a missing barn cat. The card read, Marlowe Thatching Tools, Repairs, Needles, Legat Faces. The first request came from a museum carpenter in Maryland. The second came from a restoration crew repairing a reed-roofed outbuilding near Mount Vernon. By summer, the mailing list held more than 40 names, written in pencil because Ines expected addresses to change. She accepted only the work she could finish without rushing. Caleb continued arriving on Saturdays. He learned to manage the fire, then to draw square stock round without leaving cold shuts along the corners. When Ines corrected his hammer angle, he listened with his head tilted slightly, the way Elias once had when testing a bearing by sound. One April morning, Caleb carried a wrapped board into the forge. He had carved it from walnut salvaged from the dead limb. The old sign above the door had once read Marlowe Thatching Tools. Caleb had copied those words in the same narrow lettering, then added a second line beneath them. Ines ran her thumb through the fresh carving. Caleb looked toward the bench where Ruth's photograph stood beside the lantern. They mounted the sign beneath the eaves before lunch. It was not painted. Rain would silver it slowly, and the letters would deepen as the softer grain weathered around them. That winter, Ines began a letter on heavy paper. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote that the roof had been repaired twice, once with cedar and once with patience. She recorded the well depth, the chimney ratios, the names of the people who had refused payment, and the proper colour of steel before a long taper. She explained which floorboard still creaked near the back wall and why the original glass must never be replaced merely because its view was imperfect. She did not tell the next keeper what life to build. She wrote only what the work had taught her. Keep the tools dry. Leave enough fuel for morning. Do not spend inheritance to avoid learning. And never strike harder than you can listen. The house had been waiting for her. Ines folded her letter along 3 deliberate creases and placed it inside the iron handle. Outside, snow had begun collecting on the restored roof. Caleb's sign moved once in the wind, then settled against the chains. The historic Thatching needle forge waits. It has always waited. Years later, Evelyn Pritchard retired from the county office. On her final afternoon, she emptied the drawers, bundled old parcel files, and removed the glass paperweight from her desk. Beneath it lay the second dollar from Ines's bid, flattened but unspent. Evelyn returned the paperweight to its place and left the dollar inside the drawer for the next clerk.